This covers both Splatoon 1 and Splatoon 2's specials, so I'll be incorporating both of them. So I guess we'll just get started. They do get rated in how useful they are in their own game. That is how I'm approaching this. It's the same with the subs that I had just finished wrapping up. I base it on how they were useful in their own game. The problem with this specific tier list maker that I have here is repeating subs weren't separated. As you can see, ones like Suction Bomb and Splat Bomb don't have a double, so I had to address that manually. So let's start with the first one on the list, Inkjet. Inkjet has had a pretty up and down history of being useful and useless. Early on, it was seen that Inkjet was pretty much just a way to have a target on your back. It was just like a giant target that said, you can just shoot me. It was super obvious. It was super easy to take down an Inkjet. Now that people have gotten better at it and they've made some changes to Inkjet, it's a bit better than it has been. Now it sits in the camp of being useless if you aren't good with it, and being really good if you are good with it. Which I think that's exactly how something like this should be. It has a pretty high skill ceiling, I'd imagine, and I'd make that claim. If you're really good with an Inkjet, then Inkjet has really good value. If you aren't good with Inkjet, then you're not going to get as much value, and you're probably not going to get very far with it. For that reason, I would probably put Inkjet at A, just because it sits in the middle of being useful and useless depending on the player that's using it. If I had to base it solely off like high level play, I'd probably put it in S, just because higher level players that get more usefulness out of the Inkjet, it would be more useful, and it's better if the player that's using it is better. If the player that's not using it if the player is using it that isn't very good at it, then it doesn't have nearly as much value. I'd put it at middle of the road for how good it can be and how bad it can be depending on the situation and the player. Stingray is also an example of a weapon that has had a pretty good history of being really good, in the fact that for many people, Stingray was the reason they stopped playing this game. I'm somebody who formerly played Splatoon competitively, and the team I played for, we played at high level. We were an X Division team, but even my teammates got fed up with Stingray. Most of the people I played with quit because of this special. In a game where the objectives are pointed out to you in like Rainmaker, Tower Control, and Clan Blitz, where you are just a giant target to something like the Stingray, then you're just going to die. If you're talking about like in the position of the tiers, this isn't like in order of like in any particular order. There isn't an order when they're in a tier. So yeah, Stingray, in modes like Rainmaker, Tower Control. Sorry, I had to sneeze. In modes like Rainmaker, Tower Control, and Clan Blitz, Stingray has always had really good value. When it launched, Stingray was laughably bad because you couldn't even squid when you had it. You had to be completely stationary. And then they immediately fixed it by making it really, really good and making it really oppressive. They had to spend the entirety of... They spent quite a bit trying to retune it to make it not super good. I'm going to put it in S because its overall usefulness is still really high in the objective-based modes. In Splat Zones, it has less value because there isn't a giant glowing target for the Stingray to point at. And then it's also been backpedaled a bit in the sense that you can no longer sit in your spawn and be free and invulnerable when you use the Stingray. So it's definitely been tuned back enough. But in those modes, Rainmaker, Tower Control, and Clan Blitz, the Stingray is still probably the most oppressive special in the entire game. So it has to have... It sits in a higher tier because of how oppressive it is in the 75% of the modes that get played. Tenta Missiles. Tenta Missiles have had a 180 in the community's perception of the special. The Tenta Missiles have had a 180 in terms of community perception. When at the start of the game, people perceived the Tenta Missiles to be the least useful special in the entire game because of how long it took for you to fire out all the missiles. You had to stay out of the fight, and then it took forever for the missiles to actually land and do something. Everybody agreed that Tenta Missiles were like bottom tier. However, I thought of the usefulness of the Tenta Missiles differently than most people. See, what you mentioned there, that is what I had talked about. Early on, I even have a YouTube video. I made a YouTube video talking about this years ago. I always approached it differently in that the usefulness of missiles was actually amplified when you were communicating. Because the people that were using the Tenta Missiles could see where the opponents are. If you were communicating with teammates, then Tenta Missiles had a lot more value because you could see not only where the enemy was at the time, but you could see where they were moving after you fired the missiles. Nobody else at the time thought the same way as I did. Maybe, well, I shouldn't say that. There probably was people that thought it the same way, but in terms of like the competitive side, almost nobody thought the Tenta Missiles were useful. Everyone thought that they were useless, and when I made the video talking about Tenta Missiles being good and how I went into talking about using it for callouts, people still thought that they were not good, and people thought I was just trying to read too much into it. Now that Tenta Missiles fire faster, do more damage, have more painting, people have realized that, oh wait, there is something useful to this, and still to this day, teams don't use missiles correctly, and I say that in, I watch a lot of streams of scrims and practice and stuff like that, and when I hear high-level players using missiles and just saying, I'm missiling 2 of them, that makes me cringe. That is like, I don't use that word often, but it really makes me cringe when people don't effectively use the information they have. When the whole point of the special is you get to see where the enemy is, when people aren't using that information and just aren't using it correctly, it just baffles me. Especially when the community knows that that's a really good plus side to it. But I'll still see teams flip-flop between using it for something and using it for callouts to then just saying something so blanket as, I'm just missiling 1 or missiling 2. That has always rubbed me the wrong way. So, Tenta Missiles went from being one of the most universally disliked specials and seen as the worst, to now people would argue that missiles is annoying and can be useful. And for that reason, I'm going to put it in A with Inkjet, because it provides a utility that when used by players that know how to get the value out of the utility, then it can be good. But if it's used by somebody who can't get the usefulness out of it, then it's just sort of meh. All it's really going to do is just paint for you, and maybe help you find where enemies are. Missiles also has a unique property in that it's one of the few specials that builds the special by using the special. You can build another Tenta Missile by using a Tenta Missile. The paint that it covers will build your next special, which doesn't happen very often with other specials. Next up, we're jumping to Splatoon 1 in the Kraken. The Kraken, for like 90% of Splatoon 1, it was uncontested in terms of how good it was. I'm going to just immediately put it in S because the Kraken was universally considered to be like one of the best specials in the entire game. Especially earlier on, where there was no knockback from it, you couldn't push a Kraken away. Kraken was super powerful. Also, what's up, Dusk? Thanks for showing up. Kraken is also has the fastest kill time of anything between both games. Kraken could kill in 1 frame. The very first frame of a Kraken's jump could kill. So it's unique in that it's the fastest kill across both games. It literally provided invulnerability. It provided near instant invulnerability. And the only way for it to be stopped in early Splatoon was to just run away from it. In later Splatoon, you could shoot a Kraken to keep it away from you, but early days, Kraken was definitively the best special. Then we have Killer Whale, which a lot of people were hoping that Stingray would get rebalanced and retooled into the Killer Whale, and then people also thought Killer Whale was going to come back as well. Killer Whale is a more focused Stingray in that you just set up one thing, let it go, and it fires in a straight line. Killer Whale was actually the reason why some maps and modes in Splatoon 1 got banned from the solo rotation. In Splatoon 1, if you go and play Splatoon 1 right now and play solo queue, you cannot get port mackerel tower control or Rainmaker in solo queue, and it's because of Killer Whale. A flat map and Killer Whale together was like a dream combo, and enough Killer Whales could completely make it impossible to move on port mackerel. So they actually banned them from solo rotation because teams could make it almost impossible to play on those maps using this special. It was also because splash walls were more oppressive back then, so splash walls could immediately lock out a path on port mackerel, and there weren't nearly as many ways to get back into the map as there are now. So it was a lot easier to like sort of gimp and like make it really annoying to play on port mackerel. So Killer Whale, other than having a really good lockdown potential in straightaways, it was really good for clearing tower in tower control. It lasted long enough to where you could fire it at the tower and then have your entire team rush it and deny a push in overtime. It was really good at tower path denying and clearing tower. That I would put it in A because of how situationally good it was. It wasn't good in just spamming Killer Whale. It had to have a purpose behind using it, but in its purpose and its the areas that it was good in, it was really good at. And then we have Inkzuka. Inkzuka is going to go in S. Inkzuka may arguably have been, if Inkzuka stayed the way it was at launch, Inkzuka would probably be considered X. And the reason why is Inkzuka is one of the few specials, or it was one of the few specials, that the player actually had a way of modifying it and adjusting how it worked. And what I mean by that is based on how you would angle the camera and how you would manipulate your Inkling, you could change the hitbox of the Inkzuka as well. And then early Splatoon, you could basically like quick fire the Inkzuka. They ended up making it to where you can't do that. You can't rapid fire the Inkzuka, but it's actually still possible. If you go into Splatoon 1's single player, you can actually use the original Inkzuka, as it was never fixed in solo, or not solo, in single player. They never fixed it. So you could get an idea of what rapid fire Inkzuka was like, and it was very insane. But even after they fixed it, Inkzuka was still a really good option because of how much range it had. It was a one-shot, and how much like vertical range it had. It was really good. It was a good option for any sort of weapon to deny anything close up because of how fast Inkzuka shot, or any long range because of how far it could go. Ink Strike is not good. Ink Strike was only really good in Turf War and Splat Zones. And you could argue it could be used to pop the Rainmaker shield as well, but Ink Strike was never really as useful as anything else in the game. I'm going to put it in C for different reasons than I put Toxic Mist in C. The Ink Strike had its uses, but was completely overshadowed by everything else in the entire game, and was also overshadowed by even main weapons in the game. Some just main weapons did a better job painting than the Ink Strike did, and the Ink Strike took you out of painting to fire it. Echolocator, for the time that it existed and what Echolocator did, I'm going to put it in X. The reason being is, in a game where the whole purpose of the game is about hiding in ink and trying to be like sneaky or like being able to hide in small amounts of ink, Echolocator was an instant denier of positioning and space. If you were trying to like hide in a corner and wait for the enemy team to go past you, and an Echolocator was used, at that exact moment, you were screwed. Echolocator was just so good and so useful for the vast majority of Splatoon that it actually shifted the community's, like the way the community played the game. Echolocator was so good that the community universally started running cold-blooded to stop it. It affected how the community played the game, and I'd actually attribute Echolocator being so good as to why the community started to shift towards being more hyper-aggressive with things like quick respawn and stealth jump. When Echolocator's value is increased by how like long a match goes and how more drawn out things are, it's the only real answer to that is to just be hyper-aggressive. If you aren't afraid that you're marked, then the value of Echolocator goes down. If you're a team that is afraid that they're caught out, then Echolocator has more value. All it has to do is just show where you are, and it did it for everybody. You could see the entire enemy team no matter what. So I would say, because of how good peak Echolocator was, it deserves an X rank because of how much it impacted the game. It changed how the game was played. It changed how the community played the game. It made an ability a perma-run. And very few things in the game's history across both of them have done that. Now, with Bubbler. I'm going to put Bubbler in S because it deserves it. Bubbler is the same as Kraken in that it is an almost instant invincibility. However, unlike Kraken, the Bubbler still allows you to use the rest of your kit. And this became a very, very big problem with our old friend, the Zinc Mini. The Zinc Mini was the shining example as to why Bubbler was a problem. Early on, like, bubble weapons weren't really that good. Most Bubbler weapons tend to be on short-range weapons, or weapons that just sort of needed it for survival. Like, I think of like the custom Hydra in Splatoon 1 having a Bubbler. But the Zinc Mini was the example of a weapon that had no reason to have a Bubbler, and yet had it. And then it also had the Disruptor, which, what I mentioned earlier, completely disables the entire playstyle. It disables an entire player. Bubbler, again, like Kraken, at launch you couldn't really do anything against it, but they ended up adjusting it to make it to where you could push it away by shooting at it. The one thing that Bubbler has over Kraken is that you can distribute the Bubbler. Teammates that come by you will also receive the Bubbler shield, and then they too will also be invulnerable to damage. So these Kraken and Bubbler were like defining specials in Splatoon 1, and were almost always good and almost never bad. Ultrastamp, this is a one that I feel I'm pretty divided on in comparison to the community. The community has had their view on the Ultrastamp has changed a bit. When it first came out, the Ultrastamp had a pretty interesting hitbox. It also provided some interesting invulnerability. But since then it has changed and it's not nearly as good as what it used to be. No, Ultrastamp is only in Splatoon 2. I would put Ultrastamp in A, just because, much like the other specials here, it's good depending on the player that's using it, but if an Ultrastamp is just used out of nowhere, its value isn't really that good. It used to be when it came out, because you were provided some sort of invulnerability from ahead. You could just rush people down the Ultrastamp. They've since made it to where you could be shot as the hammer goes up and down, so you're not technically invulnerable. So that's also diminished its value. And then most people don't really have any real... It just doesn't really get as much value as most things in the game. It can just be used to just rush in, or you can just chuck it at somebody. But more often than not, I see people using Ultrastamp now as like a response to someone being close to them, because you can activate the special and jump immediately and deal damage. So if somebody's like in your face, you can just pop your Ultrastamp and almost instantly kill somebody. That's most of the time that's what I see it get used for nowadays. And then we have the Booyah Bomb. Booyah Bomb is possibly like one of the closest things to like a panic button Splatoon 2 has, in that it provides you that armor as well as giving you a bomb. I would probably put Booyah Bomb... I'd put Booyah Bomb in A. And it seems like I'm putting a lot of things in A. It's because I feel like one of the things Splatoon 2 did well in comparison to the first game is that a lot of specials are good in situational uses and have their situational uses to them. Booyah Bomb, I think, fits that bill in that it has its uses, but at its core, if it's not used correctly, it's not that good. People that try to solely use it as a panic button aren't very good. It also, if you try to hold the Booyah Bomb, that's also not good because you can just get killed through it. Most of the community's approach to how Booyah Bomb works is more or less it's a panic button, but it's not a good panic button. But that's how it gets treated. If it's used effectively, the Booyah Bomb can have good value, as it's really good for denying space, denying positioning, and getting some quick paint out. It is essentially like what Ink Strike is, except it's a better Ink Strike. Then we have Bubble Blower. Bubble Blower, I'm going to put in S, because Bubble Blower is... It's a good scare tactic. Bubble Blower almost always poses a threat, it continues to pose a threat even after the bubbles have been shot. If you do not leave if you leave the bubbles alone, they will continue to provide a perpetual threat. They provide a shield to the people if somebody tries to hide inside the bubbles. They provide a barrier for them. And they can also be used for denying subs. And then people can also use Bubble Blower and then immediately pop them with certain kits. If people are running double bomb builds, or toss a bomb, Bubble Blower, then toss a bomb. After that, they can be immediate burst damage. The usefulness of a bubble blower is significantly higher than most specials in Splatoon 2, just because of the constant threat they provide, and that you can just continue to run like more and more special power up to make it even more and more deadly. So I'd put it in S just because of how much of a threat bubble blower poses, regardless if it's used correctly or not. Then we have Baller. Baller was in an interesting position early on when Baller was really good and could just face rush and tank almost like 1,000 damage. It was actually, it's funny to think about. In Splatoon 1, people, like early Splatoon 1, people were talking about how the arrow spray was going to be meta because of how fast it painted, and that never truly happened in competitive play. Arrow spray was meta for a bit in Splatoon 2 purely because of Baller. Arrow spray actually was meta for a time because of how quick it could build Baller when Baller was overpowered. Nowadays, Baller is much like Booyah Bomb, treated as a panic button, even though it's not really good as a panic button. If you just try to pop it as a last-ditch resort, you're still going to die. And then most weapons that get run, especially nowadays, will shred through a Baller instantly, so its health doesn't last nearly as long as it used to. So all Baller really is useful for is to lead a path or to escape. If somebody tries to run straight at somebody with a Baller, it doesn't really get as much value as it once did. So I would probably put Baller either at A or B, honestly. A, because it's like with the other specials in A, its value is dependent on how good the player itself is. But I'm going to put it in B because the overall usefulness of it is diminished from what it used to be. It's just not as good as it once was, and its overall impact, if used, is just not as high. It's a good way to get focused down when using it, that most times it's not used correctly and is used as a panic button when it doesn't even do that well. And then people who try to use it as a panic button manage to actually get into the Baller, almost always pop it immediately to try and get some damage and escape. So I'd put it in B just because it's not really as useful anymore, and that it's just not used correctly anymore. Then we have Inkstorm. Inkstorm is, I've mentioned it with some other people. I think Inkstorm is a good initiator. I think Inkstorm is good as a way to start a fight or start a push. Other than that, that's pretty much it. I'm going to put Inkstorm in B because it is fairly one-dimensional in what it can do. It is just a way to just move some paint forward. You can't really... Inkstorm is unlikely to kill somebody. It's unlikely to really contribute a whole lot. It is a good way to initiate something. If you throw an Inkstorm into like the path of a splat zone and you push up with it, then that's where its value can come from. Or trying to provide damage as you try to push into the enemy team. But overall, Inkstorm's usefulness is not that high. It becomes slightly more useful if you stack Inkstorms because the damage stacks, but other than that, Inkstorm is pretty one-note, so I wouldn't consider it very highly in terms of everything else. This is also an interesting one because this tier list maker doesn't do this correctly. I would not rate all the bomb launchers in the same tier. Just because the amount of special charge that the Booyah Bomb gives isn't really that big of a deal. It's not going to do anything to like make it different. The tier list maker not having these split up is a problem because there's very different value in each of them. Like, I would not put a splat bomb launcher in the same tier as the curling bomb launcher. That's a good idea. So the splat bomb launcher I would put probably in A because it's good paint coverage, it's good confusion, it's good like panic, it's really good at suppressing people. The suction bomb launcher, I would probably put in S because of it does everything the splat bomb launcher does, but it does it a little bit better in denying movement because of how much longer it takes a suction bomb to explode. It lasts longer and sits there and provides a longer threat, and so it generally just provides more of what's the word I'm looking for? Basically, it does Splat Bomb Launcher's job better in that it's denying space for longer. It may not paint nearly as fast because of how long it takes to explode, but it denies space longer than the Splat Bomb does. And then it also, if you're trying to like pop the Rainmaker shield, the Suction Bomb Launcher has more damage than the Splat Bomb does. The Curling Bomb Launcher, we're going to put that in C. And that's because the Curling Bomb Launcher completely defeats the purpose of the Curling Bomb itself. The Curling Bomb is useful for mobility purposes and like quick painting. The Curling Bomb Launcher is a questionable use of the Curling Bomb. It's also one of the few times that the special changes the attributes of the sub it's basing itself off, where Splat Bomb, Suction Bomb, and Auto Bomb launchers act pretty much identical to the sub. The Curling Bomb launcher acts differently to how a normal Curling Bomb works. And it's probably because they knew that if it worked as a normal Curling Bomb, it would not be useful. So instead they make it to where it doesn't go as nearly as far, just so it can provide more paint quickly. But overall, the Curling Bomb launcher as it is just not nearly as good as any other bomb launcher. Burst Bomb Launcher, we're going to put in A as well, because while Burst Bomb itself is considered one of the best special or best subs across both games, it as a bomb launcher is not that. It is not as good. It doesn't really provide the same sort of usefulness as the Burst Bomb alone does, because you're locking yourself into spamming it. Well, I guess technically not locking yourself, but you know what I mean. When your whole goal is to spam it, then it can be useful, but most times it's just not going to be useful. There are some situations where it'd be better to paint with your normal weapon than it is to paint with a Burst Bomb. The reason Burst Bomb is so good is because of how well it pairs off of main weapons. But when the Burst Bomb itself is the sole weapon, then it's not nearly as good as trying to couple it with your main weapon. So its overall usefulness isn't nearly as high as it would be by itself. And then Auto Bomb Launcher I'd put in B, because Auto Bomb itself, like I mentioned during the sub portion, its value is not very high for weapons that don't need it. And when there's an entire bomb launcher based around something that has very situational use, then it's not very useful. What are you going to do? Scare off, like cause an entire storm, like a stampede to chase one person? It's not really that good. I could put it in the same tier as Curling Bomb Launcher, but the difference with the Auto Bomb Launcher is it at least makes people move out of the way. Curling Bomb Launcher arguably doesn't even do that. Then we have Ink Armor. Ink Armor goes in X. Ink Armor at launch was possibly one of the most broken things in Splatoon history. Possibly like the same tier as Kraken and Bubbler were at launch. But Ink Armor has the distinction of at launch being something that outright disabled weapons. Some weapons might as well have not existed into Ink Armor. For those that didn't know, Ink Armor by its design is supposed to block one shot. However, at launch, it did more than block one shot. After shattering, Ink Armor still provided 25 frames of invulnerability. And while 25 frames in a 60 frame per second game may not sound like a lot, most weapons in Splatoon still kill in that percentage. They kill in under 25 frames. What that means is, in the time it takes for the ink armor to shatter and the invulnerability to go away, some weapons will have to have effectively killed you 2 times over. Think of like the end zap. If I remember correctly, the end zap kills in like 18 frames in Splatoon 2. So when something has 25 frames of invulnerability, plus the one shot that it tanks already, the end zap would have to spend essentially 2 times the amount of time it takes to kill, or not even to kill, an ink armor user, where the ink armor user just has to kill you once. It made certain weapons unplayable because of that exact thing. Weapons that took longer than 25 frames to kill might as well have not existed. Weapons like the Dynamo, if a Dynamo went into an ink armor player at launch, the Dynamo was never going to win. It was so oppressive that the vast majority of weapons were useless against it. And it pushed the community to trying to like focus on poke weapons, where Rapid at launch was really good because a Rapid could just stay away from ink armor and poke it out. Ink armor can be pierced now. At launch, it could not. You could not pierce ink armor at launch. So the community was forced into playing like poke weapons or just mirror matching with ink armor spam. So it has the distinction of being a rare special that just outright made certain weapons unplayable. It also is more unique than Bubbler and Kraken in the sense that it provides its usefulness to the entire team. And when it was super broken at launch, making it to where every single player on your team had that much of an advantage over the other team, it was super valuable. And I don't think across both games, even Kraken and Bubbler don't hold a candle to the value ink armor had. Well, at launch. Now ink armor is still really oppressive nowadays, but it probably, if I had to base it solely off ink armor as it is right now, it would probably be in a similar camp to Kraken and Bubbler. But ink armor itself, based off of how it itself and its history has been, it has been one of the most oppressive specials across both games in its history. And then finally, we have Splashdown. And Splashdown is not good. Splashdown used to be good. Splashdown used to be what people consider to be the only panic button in the game. Splashdown used to only work that way because of lag. Yeah, it's so easy to counter a Splashdown now, but the reason why Splashdown used to be good was because the invulnerability that Splashdown gave you at the peak of your jump was it was originally handled by the side of the player. And if there was even so much as some lag involved in the lobby or in the match and some latency, then the invulnerability could be calculated earlier on your end, because on their end, they're already at the peak of their jump. They ended up changing it after, like, I think it was like a year. They changed it to where Splashdown and its invulnerability is now calculated at the user end. So your end is what you see is what determines where they become invulnerable to damage. So in most cases, if you just continue to shoot at a Splashdown now, the Splashdown will die. 100% of the time, all it takes for you to just continue to shoot at a Splashdown and they will die. But early Splashdown, if you didn't kill them as they were initiating it, you were just going to be constantly hearing the sound of no damage being done. You'd just hear like the ting 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 ting, and then you would die. So where would I place Splashdown? I'd place it in B. The only reason it's not in C is because Splashdown still provides paint and damage. It provides a pretty simple 50 damage to anybody who's just barely outside the splasher range. But it's not in A purely because, unlike the other specials that I mentioned earlier, it's not a situation of it gets value dependent on who uses it, Splashdown's value is determined on how how bad or good the enemy player is, not how bad or good you are. You can use a splashdown in any situation, but if the enemy player is even so much as smart enough to just look up slightly, you're going to die, and you just used your special for nothing. So it has more value than Ink Storm or Ink Strike and Curling Bomb Launcher, but not enough value to be like dependent on the player itself. It's mostly dependent on if somebody is smart enough to just look up at you.